excuses are made because somebody has a mental health condition. It does not mean that you were able to do anything and behave in any way, and it should be completely excused because you are not feeling very well. As a manipulation tactic in order to coerce their victim into giving them more sympathy, tolerating worse and worse behavior, and essentially kind of sticking by them because they're unwell, well within their rights to unalive themselves. And that would be their business, not yours. That would be their responsibility, not yours. Hey guys, it's Agnes. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you're new here. I'm a psychiatric nurse and therapist. Happy Halloween to you all. So I have a pretty spooky subject to talk about today. It's probably going to be my most controversial mental health video so far. I have a little trigger warning for you. There will be discussions of pretty serious mental health conditions in this video. There will also be discussions of a topic that YouTube really doesn't like me to talk about. So I'm going to refer to it as unaliving yourself. I think we're all on the same page, okay? The unaliving yourself is going to be a pretty small amount of this video, but that subject can be really triggering for people. So please just take care with this video. So the topic of this video is how much are mentally ill people responsible for their behavior and the situations in which they find themselves. Now, I'm not using mentally ill in any kind of remotely derogatory way. I think that some of the phrasing I'm going to use in this video might seem derogatory, but when you're actually using it from like a purely mental health point of view, they're actually not derogatory whatsoever, but we're just used to hearing them as insults. So mentally ill, not derogatory, actually just factual. So just bear with me, okay? In recent years, mental health has become a really commonplace subject to discuss. I think especially with the massive rise in social media, I feel like there's mental health related content everywhere. Mostly, on the whole, I think that is fantastic. I think it has reduced stigma and raised awareness, and that is a wonderful thing. But along with mental health becoming a commonplace subject, I think that there is now an issue with mental health conditions being discussed by people who, quite frankly, don't know what they're talking about, or the discussions are being had with not nearly enough nuance. So words like depression, anxiety, narcissism, trauma, I feel like they can be sort of haphazardly thrown around by people who don't know enough about the subject to really be talking on it. And I don't want to make this video seem like it's kind of gatekeeping from a mental health topic, but any mental health professional would tell you that there is a huge amount of nuance needed to openly discuss mental health conditions like the ones that I just listed. The riskiest times that I have witnessed people using mental health conditions when they don't know enough about what they're talking about is people who have used a mental health diagnosis, or maybe even they're talking about someone who doesn't have an official diagnosis, but they're just talking about they perhaps seem low in mood, so they're using the word depression, and that this condition, when inappropriately discussed, can be used as an excuse for really bad behavior. Now, the conversation for how much is somebody who's experiencing poor mental health, how much are they responsible for their behavior? And I think that a large amount of that answer comes down to something called capacity. Capacity, as defined legally and within the kind of the mental health definition, can vary from country to country. So I am mostly talking about my experience of mental health nursing in Scotland, which is similar to the rest of the UK, but I suspect probably not similar to the US. So take this information with a pinch of salt if you're watching from America. Also, interestingly, Americans tend to use the phrase take it with a grain of salt, which in the UK would be so bizarre to say. In the UK, it's a pinch of salt. So there's a little tidbit for you, okay? There's a little tidbit for my American friends. We say pinch of salt, not grain. Capacity in the UK can loosely be defined as somebody's ability to make a decision for themselves, to understand the potential consequences of that decision, and to be able to express that decision, and to kind of understand the various ramifications of that decision. Now, you can have a mental health condition and still have capacity. Therefore, you could still have the legal ability to make all decisions for yourself. And actually, this is where the majority of people with mental health conditions sit in the UK. There are conditions in which you might have fluctuating capacity, but generally, the only time that we would find that somebody doesn't have capacity in the UK would be if they've had a deteriorating condition like dementia, or if they are experiencing psychosis or some other very, very acute mental health condition. Now, just because you have anxiety or depression or a personality disorder, that does not mean that you lack capacity. So that means that essentially in the UK, you have the right to make any decision you want. However shitty that decision might be, you are entitled to live however you want because you have been deemed by our government to be safe enough to do so. So essentially, when you have capacity, it means that you are healthy enough to make choices. And this is where the accountability and responsibility part really comes into it, because you could experience chronic depression. Chronic meaning that you are depressed for long periods of time, and there would certainly be a severity attached to that type of depression. However, you are still not blameless in your circumstances. And I don't mean blame as in like, let's allocate blame, because that's really helpful. But I mean that you could be incredibly unwell at points, but you are still able to make decisions about your health and well-being, and you are still able to make decisions about your lifestyle. So therefore, the responsibility is still on you with how you take care of yourself around that condition, how you take care of your health, given that you have that diagnosis of depression. So other examples of taking responsibility for your mental health. If you have a diagnosis of depression, or if you are feeling low in mood, you have a responsibility to seek help. I mean, you might not want any help, and that's absolutely fine, but that is still you making a choice. So it is your responsibility to seek help. It is your responsibility to engage in any support that's been given to you from mental health services, for example. It is your responsibility to take medication if that's what has been recommended. And it's essentially your responsibility to just generally take care of yourself. Similarly, if you have a diagnosis of anxiety, it is your responsibility to learn how to manage such a condition. It is your responsibility to be analytical, reflective about your brain. Again, asking for help, that is some action that you could take that is still your responsibility. But then to really, really engage with that help would also be your responsibility. If you have experienced trauma in your life, there's also a responsibility attached to that. That would look like getting psychological support and taking steps to lessen the effect of that trauma on your life. So for example, if you had experienced trauma as a child, there may be ways in which that trauma is playing out in your current relationships, even as an adult. There will be ways that that trauma is playing out in your everyday life and really impacting you. And it is your responsibility to seek help to remedy that. Even with very, very serious conditions like schizophrenia, when you are well, you have a responsibility to take care of yourself. You have a responsibility to engage with services, take medication when it has been offered to you. You still have a responsibility. Now, schizophrenia is an interesting one because that's a condition where you would likely see fluctuating capacity. So someone with schizophrenia at some points would definitely not be deemed to have capacity. There's definitely times where they may be experiencing psychosis, and they would be sort of far enough removed from their healthy mind that they actually legally, under the Mental Health Act, would not be deemed to be able to make decisions for themselves. But there are other times where they would be quite well, where they would be deemed to have capacity. And that's the point where mental health services have limited control and would really have to be guided by the service user in that example, because at that point in time, they have capacity. So therefore, when I was mental health nursing, someone in my role would not have a leg to stand on with sort of intervening in that person's life when they have capacity. Now, I'm not saying that any of these steps to take care of yourself are easy. I am not saying that looking after yourself when you're depressed or you have anxiety, you've been really traumatized, you've got schizophrenia. I'm not saying that that's easy whatsoever. What I'm trying to do is to draw a line between the area in which somebody is responsible for themselves and the area in which they should be totally let off the hook because they can't look after themselves. And this is where I think the problem occurs. This is where I have seen this problem play out, is when excuses are made because somebody has a mental health condition. I have seen this in romantic relationships play out time and time again. A very common example would be if I'm just going to allocate genders because it makes this conversation easier. And I am actually thinking of a very specific example. So just bear with me on the gender thing, okay? Where the male part of a heterosexual romantic relationship had been experiencing low mood, and he'd been experiencing low mood because of his really, really shitty childhood. So certainly a lot of trauma in his childhood, and he'd been experiencing low mood. And I bore witness to his romantic partner making a huge number of excuses for his behavior. Now, just because you have low mood, that does not mean that you were able to do anything and behave in any way, and it should be completely excused because you are not feeling very well. No, 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 no. No. Yes, mental health may be a factor in somebody's behavior. Yes, things they've been through in the past, such as trauma, may be a factor in somebody's life, but that does not mean that they get to do anything to you, say anything, behave in any way, and completely get away with it. Because that area is so dangerous for you as the person on the receiving end of shitty behavior in a relationship like that. Because whatever that person has been through, whatever mental illness they're experiencing at the time, whatever their past has looked like, they still have a duty to take care of themselves. And I'm not saying that anybody has to take care of themselves. I do think that people have a right to just disappear off and treat their bodies poorly and treat their minds poorly, sure. But if it is impacting you and you find yourself making excuses for somebody's behavior based on them being unwell in some sense, that is a really, really big problem. Hurt and unwell people, yes, they need to be taken care of in some senses. And yes, they need help in some senses, but they can still do a huge amount of damage to you. And that is where this conversation is incredibly nuanced. And that is where we all need to be really careful if we find ourselves making excuses for someone, or if that person, in fact, themselves is using their mental health as an excuse for bad behavior. Caution should absolutely be exercised in this situation. This is the part of the video where I'm going to briefly discuss unaliving yourself. And this is just an interesting, I think, little bit of information that if you are a lay person and you've not worked professionally in mental health, then this might come as a slight surprise to you. But in mental health, in Scotland at least, there are a huge number of instances where somebody might try to take their own life, and it would be absolutely no business of mental health services to get involved in that. And in fact, I feel quite strongly that everybody has the right to unalive themselves if that's what they want to do. And there are a lot of instances where if somebody has capacity, so legally, mental health wise, they're deemed to be of a state of mind where they can make decisions for themselves. If somebody who has capacity decides that they want to end their life, that is absolutely their right. Now, this conversation, it is nuanced. Obviously, it is an incredibly sad thing to think of anybody unaliving themselves. And especially if the conversation turns to young people, perhaps who are under 25, whose frontal cortex isn't fully formed, then of course, a huge amount of support and help should be offered. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't help people who find themselves in a situation where they want to unalive themselves. But essentially, if you are of sound mind, in the UK, you have a right to end your life when you want to. So coming back to mental health being used as an excuse, I think that mental health can be used at points to explain away poor behavior. And actually, I've seen this in situations where abuse is occurring, where an abuser is using mental health as a manipulation tactic in order to coerce their victim into giving them more sympathy, tolerating worse and worse behavior, and essentially kind of sticking by them because they're unwell. And actually, that's not nearly a nuanced enough review of that person's situation. Just because you are unwell does not mean that you are not also responsible for your own behavior and your own health. I think coming back to unaliving yourself, that unaliving yourself can also be used as a threat, again, by a perpetrator in order to pull on the heartstrings of a victim. So if you imagine an abuser in a relationship saying, if you leave me, I'm going to unalive myself. Again, I've heard this happening so many times. And I just need to tell you, nobody can make somebody else unalive themselves, and nobody is responsible for somebody else unaliving themselves. At the point where an irreversible decision is made by the person who's taking their own lives, at that point, nobody else is responsible for that behavior apart from the person who's doing that to themselves. So I've been in work situations where patients of mine have said, I'm going to unalive myself and it will be your fault because you didn't do X, Y, and Z that I wanted you to do. And I said to this person, I remember the situation very vividly, I said, if you choose to do that, that is absolutely your decision to make. I am not responsible for you making that choice. And I think that when we find ourselves in a romantic relationship with someone who is being highly manipulative, with somebody who is throwing around unaliving themselves as a way of coercing us, unless you have a knowledge of mental health conditions and unless you're able to look at this in a very, very nuanced way, then obviously that would work as a fantastic manipulation tactic. Obviously, you would think, whoa, that's such a big responsibility to land on my shoulders. That's such a huge risk. I'll stay. I'll do whatever you need. Please don't do that to yourself. And it is so important to be able to be very, very, very clear, completely black and white, whose responsibility is it really? And again, unless that person is actually psychotic or manic, or their brain has deteriorated to the point where they no longer have capacity, because yeah, that can happen, but it is actually incredibly rare. It is actually very unusual that someone actually lacks capacity, then that person, well within their rights to unalive themselves. And that would be their business, not yours. That would be their responsibility, not yours. So to conclude, the fact that mental health is better understood and the fact that mental health is a wider conversation, I think is absolutely wonderful. But it has left us in this really risky area where we are far more compassionate towards people with mental health conditions. We are far more understanding. But unfortunately, that is being used by some people as a manipulation. And it is so important that we're able to look out for it. So guys, that is it for this video. I really hope that it made sense. I hope that it all kind of comes together okay. I feel like I've been on a real journey. Please let me know what you thought in the comment section below. I realized this was a bit of a hot take and could have come across as kind of brutal. Let me know what you thought. And I will see you in my next video. Take good care, guys. Bye.